Well, hello, students. This is Mr. Burns, broadcasting from the basement bedroom, and we're going to talk about some more abolitionists today. And last time we left off with Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is a very influential abolitionist because she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's going to become one of the best-selling books of all time, and it was about how terrible a system slavery was and how cruel that system was to the slaves. The man we want to look at next is John Brown. We'll kind of zoom in on John Brown's picture there. He was born and lived his early life in the Ohio and Kentucky region, and from a young age he became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad isn't a railroad. Instead, it's a loose collection of people who wanted to see slavery abolished, and conductors on the Underground Railroad would help runaways find their way to freedom in the North. Station masters on the Underground Railroad usually had farms or buildings where they would allow slaves to hide in while they were making their dangerous journey to the North. So, Brown was also an activist, and one of the things that made him different from the other abolitionists was just this. You notice I have the word zealot on the page, and zealot is a pretty important vocabulary word. It comes from the Bible, and if you're described as being a zealot, that means you have some particular issue that you believe very strongly in. Often it's to the point where you're willing to sacrifice your life, and then in the other extreme, a zealot is very willing to take the life of someone who disagrees with him. So the interesting thing about Brown is that he kind of rejects this moral suasion, which is what most abolitionists believed in. They believe that if you just point out that slavery was bad, that it was evil, that it was cruel, eventually you're going to persuade enough people to come around to that point of view, and the U.S. is going to one day abolish slavery. Brown was willing to use violence. Now, he was an old man in the 1850s when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, but this law started a civil war in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Brown received a letter from his children that were living in Kansas, and he packed up and went there. And when he learned of some pro-slavery forces that had massacred anti-slavery people, he went out and retaliated at a little place called Pottawatomie Creek. He and his men and family rounded up 5 anti-slavery people, and they executed them. Brown's going to go on to try and start a slave rebellion, and his slave rebellion is going to end in spectacular failure. In 1859, he's going to try to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and Brown's plan was to use those supplies to take over and start a slave rebellion. He was captured, but in his capture, Brown is going to reach the height of his fame. He is going to put slavery on trial. So he's going to be found guilty of treason, and he is going to make slavery look terrible, and the Southerners look terrible, and he's going to win a lot of support for himself in the North. To the point that when he was executed, bells rang in the North, moaning and lamenting Brown's death. Here is another famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born a slave. She lived in Maryland, and as a child she suffered a very serious injury. She got in the way in between a master or an overseer who was angry with a slave that wasn't doing his job correctly, and this overseer threw a heavy weight, and unfortunately for Harriet, the weight struck her in the temple, and she collapsed. She had a serious head injury, and for about a week and a half, she lingered between life and death, but eventually she recovered. But there was a serious side effect to that injury. She had a lifelong condition that was much like epilepsy, where she would just go into these spells. So after Tubman escaped, and one of the interesting things about her is that she was very strong. As a slave, she had worked alongside of men and done jobs that were considered men's jobs. So she was a very powerful person. She claimed to have, and it's probably really realistic, guided over 300 people to freedom. And she liked to say that she never ran a train off the tracks on the Underground Railroad, and she never lost a person to the slave catchers who hunted them. One of the reasons probably for this is that Harriet Tubman carried a pistol with her when she went on her expeditions to the South, and if there were anybody in her crew that got afraid and threatened to wanted to run away and go back to the plantation and the master, she swore that she would kill them, that they would die on their way to freedom rather than be allowed to go back into slavery. Another interesting thing that I learned about some of these conductors on the Underground Railroad is that they carried opium with them. Daytime was very dangerous for these parties that were running away. They had to stop and they had to find shelter and they had to be extremely quiet because when slaves ran away, posses would be formed and dogs would be gathered and they would hunt the runaway slaves. So you can't be making any noise. Often entire families would flee, and sometimes there were infants. So one of the interesting things that these conductors carried was opium, and they would give a very tiny dose of opium to small children and infants so that they would sleep for 8 hours and wouldn't give away their position if slave hunters were in the area. The final thing about Harriet Tubman that's really interesting is that she was going to join John Brown in his raid on Harper's Ferry, but she had fallen ill at about the time it was planned and so did not join Brown in Virginia. Continuing on, then we'll talk about the Fugitive Slave Law, and this was a part of the Compromise of 1850. It was a part of the compromise that the South liked the most. It put the government in the business of hunting and returning runaway slaves to their masters. If you were a runaway slave, the scary thing about this law is your free state is no longer free. You could have been living in a free state for 20 years, and now your life is very dangerous because the slave hunters could come for you. On the slide you see a poster that was put up by people who oppose the Fugitive Slave Law, and it's a warning that they should be on guard because slave hunters are in their city, and if you're a runaway slave, your life is in jeopardy. So there was very little protection for a fugitive slave. If they were caught by a slave catcher, the courts didn't try to interfere with that. So people who had their identity mistaken, could very easily be pulled back into slavery. So there was a lot of civil disobedience around this law, and the civil disobedience angered southern states because they thought that the North should obey the law. But it was widely disobeyed in places where the abolition movement was strong. So sometimes you saw that in New York City, more so probably in Philadelphia and Boston because the abolition movement was stronger in those two cities. But sometimes what would happen is that the large crowds would gather to thwart the work of the slave catchers, and there are cases where these mobs would actually surround a slave catcher and take the fugitive slave away from them. So this was something that angered the South, and that anger is going to build up to Civil War. Now, we might as well touch on this. There was a lot of Southern propaganda around slavery, and I'll kind of zoom in on this picture first of all. Here we see a child, working in a textile factory, and it was very common for children to work in factories and in mines in the United States in the 1800s and even into the early 1900s. And kids worked the same shift that adults did, so they could be on their feet 12 to 16 hours a day working around these machines that were dangerous. So the Southerners put out a lot of propaganda, and this propaganda goes way back to colonial times when the slave trade really took off. In order for Europeans to make this work, the category of race was really invented. Now, race is not a scientific term; it's a social or societal construct, and race needed to be created so that we could treat blacks from Africa in the horrible ways that were done during the period of slavery. They were kidnapped from their homelands, they were separated from their families, and they were sold into slavery. And then they were shipped across the ocean to lands they did not know, and they had no hope of returning to their home. So it was an incredibly cruel system. And the only thing that violence was needed to make the slavery system work. But Southern states put out a false narrative, and this narrative was widely believed for long periods of time. And the main parts of the false narrative are that slaves were happy on the plantations, that they were very healthy on the plantations, that slave owners were all good and kind, and they took very good care of their slaves. And when a slave became too old to work, there was kind of a retirement system for them. And they contrasted this with saying, a northern factory worker didn't make very much money, they worked in dangerous conditions, and if they got hurt, it was their fault, and there was no retirement system. So starting in the 1840s and 1850s with the abolitionist movement really gaining ground, you have a counter narrative coming out where the abolitionists are putting out this message that slavery is indeed violent and it is indeed cruel. And one of the most important books that helped get this message out was Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, so this is lesson 2 from Mr. Burns on the abolitionists.